Take a look at today's papers, and we're joined now by former Young Victorian of the Year, Thom Woodroofe. Tom, good morning.
Morning.
I wonder how much longer you can hang on to the Young title. What do you reckon? When do you reckon it runs out?
Well, hopefully about 25, so we've still got a few years left.
Yeah, you got a while to go. All right, so you must be starting with Julian Assange this morning.
Of course, yeah, straight to his op-ed in The Australian. So good on him, firstly, I think, for going to an outlet that is probably giving him worse coverage than better coverage.
So this is Julian Assange's own defence of himself, and it's really the first time that we've heard directly out of his own mouth at length for quite a while, isn't it?
Correct, yeah. So in this piece, he compares himself to Keith Murdoch and emphasises his Australianism.
Yeah.
And I think that's been one of the strategies of WikiLeaks in the last few weeks in terms of their media coverage, is to emphasise that Australian link. And if you follow their Twitter, for example, they're posting or reposting a lot of articles written on the Drum website, for example. So that's interesting, but also I think they're trying to outline, the wrongful nature of Gillard's comments about the legality of his behaviour. So that all fuels into it. But towards the end of the piece, I think he goes a little bit off course, and he sort of goes back to his sort of manifesto-style writing, and that maybe weakens the overall piece a bit. But in large part, I think the media reaction to this story has too much focused on Julian Assange, and to some extent he's sort of polluted the own debate about WikiLeaks, not only his pursuit, and that should obviously be investigated separately for those charges, but his comments to some extent are eroding the transparency that he's arguing for in WikiLeaks himself.
What do you mean?
I think that by him adding fuel to the comments, or adding sort of motive to some of the comments about WikiLeaks, it to some extent degenerates what the actual platform he's trying to create is. I see.
You mean because he's imputing motives to those people in the same way as he would argue these people obfuscate and are not transparent in their dealings.
Correct. But also, the story here is not so much Julian Assange as much as it is WikiLeaks in terms of substance. As I say, the pursuit and the charges against Assange should be investigated, but that, in my opinion, should be done separately in some ways.
The story is surely him, though, as well, because he is such a mercurial and interesting figure, because he's so provocative, and because he doesn't mind putting himself at the centre of the story, really.
He's certainly provocative, and many would argue that perhaps he is a bit of a media tart, I guess, in that sense. But I think in many ways this is perhaps characterised a little bit by going after the small guy. So he doesn't conform with the natural publication cycle. He doesn't work for a big newspaper. He isn't a big newspaper. And to some extent I think that's caused perhaps a little bit of jealousy around the
sure.
media
I wouldn't call him
circles.
the small guy anymore, though, would you?
No, international force celeb, I think,
that's
Julian
right.
Burnside's words. Now, just to, if anything, emphasise his Australianness, of course, WikiLeaks has made this massive document dump to Fairfax this morning with Kevin Rudd front and centre.
And the first question should be, how did Fairfax get this ahead of the planned release at the end of January, I think it was. But look, I don't want to spend too much time on this. This is stuff we already knew. Sure, it's interesting to hear diplomats say so much of this stuff about Rudd, but also about every other issue pretty much that's come up. But all this sort of thing we pretty much knew, we just hadn't seen.
Let's have a look, though, at the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald, sure. And then we'll have a look at the Ages. So that's the condemnation of Kevin Rudd. And to me, one of the most intriguing sidebars, and it was definitely run as a sidebar in the Age, is the meeting that Kevin Rudd aggressively pursued with George Bush, only to cancel it 2 days later. I was reasonably well brung up, and I find that shocking.
Yeah, well, I remember it was around the time that he suggested basically that George Bush didn't know what the G20 was when he was trying to argue that should meet at heads of state level, heads of government level. And I remember asking some US diplomats at the time what they were reporting back to Washington. So these are effectively those cables, which is quite interesting.
And they were prepared to chat, so they weren't that secret if they were prepared to chat about the content or similar content to what they were putting in the cables.
Exactly. But, ultimately, I think, in essence, this is only going to affect Rudd. It's going to make it a little bit uncomfortable for him in the same way that things have been made uncomfortable for Hillary Clinton trying to defend these cables. But he leaves again today, so he's only been back 2 days. So he's off to Indonesia today and then Israel next week for a forum, and I might as well.
Well, look, it'll be interesting to see how the politics plays out. We've already had a comment on our email this morning saying, hang on a minute, nothing can happen to Kevin Rudd. It's such a tightly hung parliament. They couldn't run the risk of him spitting the dummy and bailing out. That's true, but I'll say this. This year in politics has taught us one thing, that all of those certainties are just out the window now. So you might say that and you might say that that's self-defeating and putting themselves in a poor position, but I'll lay you London to a brick that people inside that caucus start pushing now to get that guy out. Because those old assumptions about, oh, they wouldn't possibly do that, forget it.
Yeah, but see, I think the only thing Rudd would leave for is a better job. And the only better job he'd get is an international gig, and if anything, this is actually showing that it's probably not that likely anymore.
There goes the top job at the UN.
There goes the escape hatch.
Exactly.
Now, the issue that Kevin Rudd once described in the dim, dark past as the greatest moral challenge of our time is under discussion in Cancun, and The Age is one of many papers looking at the climate change summit.
Well, just a little bit. So buried at page 14, they have their coverage of Cancun.
Not the issue it once was.
Great shot.
Yeah.
That's a fabulous photograph, isn't it?
Yeah, there's underwater protesters. But look, I mean, compare it to Copenhagen last year, and the thing I want to emphasise here is just the media coverage again, the media angle. So last week, ABC Environment and also Media Monitors put together a piece where they worked out that 3,000 media had registered for Copenhagen, 1,200 this year, 16,000 articles written in the Australian media last year on Copenhagen, 400 during the same period on Cancun. Now, to some extent, that's just sort of the emphasis behind it, and everyone's already looking to COP17 next year in South Africa. It is interesting in the negotiations, which will ramp up this week with the arrival of environment ministers, but not that many heads of government. I think about sort of 10 are going compared to about 120 last year. It is interesting that the sort of schism between the two parties is effectively reversed. So this year there's a lot of emphasis on developed countries basically changing Kyoto, whereas the developing countries are keen to keep Kyoto because it means that they don't have to commit to anything.
And China, again, being one of the key players.
Yeah, but
whatever comes out of it.
It's interesting, the quote in that piece, the quote that piece leads with actually is China saying they will accept binding targets, though it's a bit of a quote that I would suggest is a little bit lost in translation because it's a little bit conflicting in some ways.
Hopefully no references to rodent activity regarding China's behaviour.
Absolutely not. Now, I think we're up to The Guardian, is that right?
Yep, so very quickly, Gordon Brown is about to release his book. So typical Gordon is...
another one.
Yeah, typical Gordon.
It's become a bit of a rite of passage, hasn't it? Leave office, write book.
Yeah, but incredibly quickly in his case, I might point out.
Far too quickly.
Yeah, and also typical Gordon, not Flash, just Gordon. So he's just focusing on basically the global financial crisis, though he does say he's not an expert. If you go through the appendix, there's one mention of Tony Blair, and it is, I've got the quote, Tony Blair and I spent 20 years building new Labour. He ultimately says the economy, which is what the book's about, is bigger than the Industrial Revolution will be at the moment. And this is, in my opinion, sort of something that probably positions him quite well to head up something like the World Bank or the IMF. Look, he's been extremely gracious, I think, on the backbench in the last few months. He's done a couple of paid speaking gigs, but he's been quite good. And the other interesting thing, I think, will be the acknowledgement section, where all his former advisors who he used to throw typewriters at and so forth, they're called wonderful and
great praise.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that'll be one of the best parts to read.
So many of them seem to mean anger management. It's amazing. The Financial Times you're having a look at as well this morning, Tom.
Yeah, very quickly. So the Oslo Peace Prize Ceremony happens on Friday, which is where I'm spending Christmas, so looking forward to that.
Very good.
19 countries are not attending this year, and I just wanted to point out that, again, this is a little bit sort of overinflated perhaps by the coverage in the media, because, look, 2 years ago in 2008, when it was not a very controversial Finnish politician who won it, 10 countries didn't attend, so it's pretty usual that quite a few can't anyway.
And you're going to finish with some happy snaps.
Yeah, Foreign Policy Blog, which is a great little blog on the web, have some great photos of Medvedev and Putin.
He's got his shirt on, that's no good.
Yeah, it's matching shirts, basically showing that everything's fine in terms of who's going to actually be on the ticket in 2012.
We like each other.
They even invited their mate Berlusconi up to Sochi, which is the Olympic site for 2014.
Wow, I wonder how those three party. Wow.
So,
you just don't want to think about that, do you?
No.
Yeah, exactly. So that's certainly the world leaders at the top of their game there, I think.
Tom Woodroofe, good to see you. Thanks so
You
much.
guys too, thanks.
Thank you, and happy Christmas.
You too.